for their freewheeling comedy. Back in cinemas this week, the Coen brothers sought creative help from super producer T-Bone Burnett, whose music for the film sparked a folk revival upon its release and launched the careers of many of its contributors. It may be the film's greatest legacy, writes. One autumn day in 1959, a field recordist named Alan Lomax sat at the roadside and watched a Mississippi chain gang chop logs. One of the prisoners, James Carter, led a chorus of his fellow inmates in a bluesy work song as they swung their axes. Lomax taped the men before proceeding on his way. The song slipped its chains, lived on, and roamed free. The singers at the roadside, God help them, stay put. Carter's primitive prison work song, Po Lazarus, would eventually resurface on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Joel and Ethan Coen's freewheeling comedy about a trio of dopey fugitives in Depression-era Dixieland. You can hear it playing over the opening scene, just before George Clooney's preening, wily Ulysses Everett McGill cuts through the cornfield to the railroad to escape. Everett has convinced his sidekicks, played by John Turturro and Tim Blake Nelson, to join him in a search for buried treasure. But the man is a huckster who lies as naturally as he breathes, and so it's likely his treasure will amount to a pile of fool's gold. Times and dates tend to blur in rural, off-grid Mississippi, and so it is too with Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, which has its feet, hands, and fingers in several different decades. The film is reissued this week to commemorate its 25th anniversary, but the story is set in 1937 and features a repertoire of songs that range from Harry McClintock's 1928 rendition of The Big Rock Candy Mountain to pin-sharp folk covers from the late 1990s. As Everett chivies his buddies across the Delta, tangling with sheriffs and Klansmen and corrupt politicians, this music dips and swells in glorious sympathy. Po Lazarus is the overture, the early signpost, pointing the way to a spread of bluegrass ditties and gospel staples that extends all the way through to the final credits. The soundtrack provides the film's soul and its connective tissue. It would later prove to be its stash of buried treasure as well. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Is adapted, very loosely, from the Odyssey, playfully lifts its title from a pompous, unmade movie in Preston Sturges' Sullivan's Travels, 1941, and bounces, Brer Rabbit style, through a cartoonish Deep South and a road fraught with peril. The film takes its lead from Clooney's energetic performance in that it is bumptious, charming, and possibly a shade too pleased with itself. It's not my favorite Coen brothers picture. That's a three-way tie between No Country for Old Men, The Big Lebowski, and Inside Llewyn Davis, but it's irrepressibly entertaining and more savagely satirical than it first appears, like a Looney Tunes tour of America's Jim Crow era. The characters may be exaggerated, verging on the grotesque, but there is usually a real-world inspiration lurking just out of shot. The imperiled bluesman who claims to have sold his soul to the devil is an obvious stand-in for Robert Johnson, while Charles Durning's crooked, pork-barrel governor is based on the true-life Pappy O'Daniel, who sang old-time country western and once stole an election from the young Lyndon Johnson. If Oh Brother contains anything so blunt as a message, it is that good music endures and redeems those who play it, even when those people are a band of bumbling convicts called the Soggy Bottom Boys. In the case of Oh Brother, it lasts even longer than a good movie does, because while the Coens' comedy remains beloved by its fans, not least, bizarrely, the former U.S. Senator Mitt Romney, who cites it as his all-time favorite film. In cultural terms, it has been gazumped by its merch, upstaged by its music. It joins Saturday Night Fever and The Harder They Come on an elite list of hit movies that wound up playing second fiddle to their soundtrack albums. On some level, perhaps, this was all preordained. The Coens had only a title and a vague story in mind when they hired producer T-Bone Burnett to help fill in the blanks. Burnett, in turn, made a playlist of American folk songs that would serve as a guide when the Coens wrote their script. So the Oh Brother soundtrack existed before the film even did. It wore an assistant's hat during the writing and production process and then returned at the end to claim its share of the spoils. Following the initial fanfare of the movie's release, Burnett's 18-track compilation, was credited with almost single-handedly sparking the early noughties folk revival. It sold nearly 9 million copies in the U.S. alone and helped boost the careers of Alison Krauss and Gillian Welch. At the 2002 Grammys, where the soundtrack won the Album of the Year award, 74-year-old Ralph Stanley reprised his a cappella version of "Oh Death" from the film.